Hello and welcome to the OLM Dev Working Group. Today is Thursday, May 19th. On the agenda for today, we had a discussion around the plain bundle metadata format. This is something that we've been iterating on recently, and there is a linked document that kind of goes over a baseline proposal of what metadata could look like in this new bundle format. Going through the document that's linked, I can go ahead and share my screen. That'll be a little bit easier. The document kind of goes over the background and compares and contrasts the existing Registry V1 bundle format, which has a rich set of metadata associated with it under the metadata directory in the bundle file system. There's like an annotations.yaml file, and there's additional properties.yaml file, and these files constitute the bundle's metadata and provide a lot of additional information surrounding the contents of the bundle that's not already embedded in the CSV itself, which is also a store of metadata in the Registry V1 world. So as we look at our new bundle media type, the plain V0 bundle type, we kind of need to come up with some similar metadata systems such that these bundles have an identity, and they have some properties internal to them that can be read by an external system or a consumer. So this is a proposed metadata structure that we have in the document based off of a work in progress PR that Joe made. Essentially, we encode the API version and kind, sort of the standard Kubernetes manifest fields, with the actual metadata information, such that based on these fields, you can say that the schema version is V0. It's 0 for the plain V0 format, and the kind of the object plain refers to the actual type of the bundle. So this is kind of like using the sort of existing GVK primitives to express some metadata around the bundle. This would be in a separate file, maybe potentially a bundle.yaml file alongside the other files that exist in the manifest directory. And so this is sort of a first stab at it, but I think there's also the question of, okay, what other additional metadata do we want? If every bundle is associated with a package, then we should have the package name be a field on this spec as well. If every bundle has a semantic version, then we would potentially want a semantic version as well. And so this is just a high level view of sort of the problem space. And I just wanted to maybe kick off the discussion thinking about if we could have, if we wanted to encode any arbitrary metadata into a plain bundle in this new format, what would be some of the required fields that we would see and in potentially this bundle.yaml file. So I will stop talking. I will open it up now.
Oh, sorry, Joe, I see you have your hand up. I'll let you go for that.
Sure. So the one question I had was, are we trying to come up with a metadata schema for all bundles or just for the plain bundle?
Right. That's a fair question. Maybe we should focus on the latter, and then that would inform the former. Oh, I see people have their hands raised. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but so before we move on from that, unless other people want to talk about it, I guess the one thing I wonder is like if we're going to talk about the schema of the bundle, then it seems like you want all the bundles to put their schema in the same place. Otherwise, how do you discover the schema? I think is the kind of the root of the question I was asking.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I think Tim, you had your hand raised next.
Yeah, I had a similar question, although because I know we've been thinking about some higher level components that build on some of this stuff we worked on in Ruckpack. It's a little unclear to me, like especially if we start declaring bundle level dependencies. One, it feels like it's weird for Ruckpack to get into that domain, but how else would consumers exit that information? And the other thing was, sorry, I'm blanking on this now. Like, for example, let's say we have a config map, and I don't remember who brought this point, but a bundle could just be arbitrary content, right? It could just be a config map that contains like OPA rules that we expect to be activated, right? In which case, what is the minimal set of metadata that we could care about or consumers care about there? Is it like the versioning? I know it's hard to see like a required metadata field or metadata file hit all those use cases.
So I can at least answer that from my perspective. So I always try to look at this through the lens of what other package managers do. And so I kind of think of Ruckpack like RPM-I. So like RPM doesn't care what the metadata is, but if you ever want to look at a collection of packages, you care. So the way that RPM works is there's an RPM spec file that you declare, like, here's the name of the package, here's the version, here's the release number, there's a bunch of metadata that goes along with it. So it seems like I think we should define some identity metadata that lives at the Ruckpack level, like in the bundle spec, but Ruckpack itself doesn't necessarily care about it other than to say, well, I think there's two things, right? One is Ruckpack could just inform you like, oh, here's the package name and version information about it. The thing that you installed, such that you have some provenance to go look up what it is. And the other is that, like with RPM-I, if you do like RPM-I, MariaDB v1 and then RPM-I MariaDB v2, it's going to say like, well, you already have MariaDB installed, so I'm not going to reinstall. Like it knows, right, that those two things are related. So I wonder, like, if at the Ruckpack level, it should have at least some awareness of like, oh, I've already installed something with this package name, so there's only one of those, even just at the Ruckpack layer.
And Joe, when you say bundle spec, are you alluding to the core Ruckpack GVK, or are you talking about this bundles.ruckpack.io?
I don't know. Maybe give me some more context about what I said, because I don't know if I'm totally grokking your question.
I think we don't have to do this back and forth. I think we were talking about something like a spec.package or a spec.version.
Right. So you're asking like, where would that be defined? Like, is that on a per schema thing, or is that like all bundles? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah, I think that's what I was going towards, but
I think that's where it gets really interesting, right? Like, I guess what I would imagine is that every bundle type can define what its metadata is, and then it's like a provisioner that gets to decide like, oh, I'm like trying to provision all bundles of this type, and therefore I can apply some sort of, I can have a webhook that validates stuff that are matching that type, or I can have some logic inside the reconciler that knows about the collection of those types. But imagine like a file, like a Linux system that has, for some reason, both apt, like Debian apt and DNF installed at the same time. Those two things don't know about each other. So if you had a DNF package called foo and an apt package called foo, you could happily install those together as long as they didn't somehow, maybe you could do it period, but if they had overlapping files, I'm guessing one of them would complain that if you tried to install the second one. But that's kind of what I imagine is like every single bundle format can kind of self-define what its metadata is, and then it's up to the provisioner kind of to regulate the expectations around that bundle format, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And then maybe we need some of that mapping between bundle format and provisioner. Never mind, I'll just go for this. But yeah, that answers it.
I'm just listening.
I was just thinking.
Tyler, you had your hands up for a while.
Yeah.
Hey, John Doctor, I think your mic is hot right now. Just a heads up. But yeah, so I was wondering what we ultimately want to get out of this metadata. I think that we talk about it with this bundle here, but I think, or sorry, this document here. But what I'm nervous of is potentially solving some of the problem space that DEPI would inevitably solve. And like, I guess my question is, philosophically, is RuckPack a package manager equivalent, or is it just something that stamps out bundles and instantiates content? So that's kind of the question I'm getting at, and what this metadata provides is something that I'm trying to understand.
So I can try to answer this one too. So again, in my mind, I think it's about like identity, not how this bundle relates to other bundles. So I would expect that like RuckPack plain manifest format would say, I want all my bundles to have a global unique ID. And like, so to do that, like you have to define the package, the version, and the release of this bundle. And that's really all that RuckPack cares about. And then when you get up to higher levels, you're right, like, okay, well now I want to say this bundle depends on some other bundles. In that case, like, okay, now you're involving like a separate system, and that other system is going to have some API that it wants you to use to interact with it. So I would imagine is that, it would either say like, you've got to drop a different file in your bundle at a different place that I know to look, or, something that like is not really in the realm of RuckPack necessarily.
So
like I can imagine like a DEPI metadata file that if you're wanting to do resolution with DEPI, then you put this file in there. Now DEPI knows to go find it and read stuff out of it. But like I'll hand wave a little bit and say that the design that we have doesn't read the contents of the bundle image until it's already like until we've done resolution. So whatever we come up with has to end up in the catalog at some point for DEPI to do anything with it.
So this is mainly just to understand like the name, the version, and the provisioner that the bundle supports. Am I understanding that correctly? That sort of information?
Yeah, but I would probably say like the bundle doesn't say which provisioner it uses. The bundle says, here's the format that I am. And then it's the provisioner that
Sorry, yeah, my bad.
to decide. But yeah, basically like in my mind, the level of metadata that's at the RuckPack bundle format layer is purely identity metadata.
Okay, got it. And so it's basically the bundle being able to say, I am this format, and here's my name and here's my version, right? So
right.
Okay, I think I'm understanding. Yeah, that makes sense.
That's my opinion, at least. I mean, others feel free definitely to state theirs.
I think it'd be nice to have, or Dan, you can go.
Sorry, no, I was gonna say I agree. Go ahead, Tim.
I don't know. I'm still trying to wrap my head around like what's really required to build on top of Ruckpack right now. I'm sure a lot of you have. Like it feels pretty nice, and this might have been outlined in the straw man, but it would be nice to have something such that I could just tell a provisioner class this is the format of the bundle, or some sort of identification metadata. Maybe it's a selector, field selector, whatever the matching logic is at the provisioner class level. It's just unclear how at a higher level system or component would be able to determine that ahead of time when configuring Ruckpack APIs. So like maybe identity is a big part of that. Maybe individual or rather explicit formatting at the plain bundle metadata level is sufficient for that. I'm not too sure yet.
Yeah, I think that's the bare minimum, right? Like, I guess what I would imagine is that whatever the component is that makes a resolve set bundle, which is basically the manifest that contains the set of things that we want to be deployed, that thing has to know which provisioner class names to use when it generates those desired bundle instances. So based on that straw man that Tim's referencing, the idea is basically that like somewhere there's a mapping that says like, oh, when you see a bundle with this format or with this property or, you know, with some other sort of, you know, lookup mechanism, map that over to this provisioner name. And that's something that is like an API on the cluster that the cluster admin can manipulate. So I would imagine that like OLM or Ruckpack would ship with a provisioner that you know, knows how to deal with plain manifest bundles. And then if we ship DEPI and something that makes these things, then we probably ship with like a default mapping API or whatever we're going to call it that says like, oh, if you see a plain manifest bundle, then use the Ruckpack core provisioner. And that's kind of what we ship with by default. And then if a cluster admin said like, well, I want to ship these bundles based on, you know, their package name prefix or something over to a different provisioner, then we give them the knobs to be able to kind of tweak which provisioners handle which bundles more at runtime rather than, I think what we want to avoid is having the bundles themselves say like, here's the provisioner that I need, right? Because then like that cluster admin doesn't really get a choice.
So I had a follow-up question on this proposed mapping. So the purpose of it is like to have the DEPI layer be able to know what plain provisioner ID to use when it stamps out this like resolve set bundle as an output of its resolution. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, but Joe, it's also possible that multiple provisioners could all work on the same bundle type, right?
Right. But I think what you want is like at this layer, you need to pick one provisioner. So you might have 3 provisioners on your system that understand plain manifest bundles. This layer is the thing that says, oh, that bundle should be pointed over to, you know, that provisioner. So it has to know which of those plain manifest provisioners are the ones that should be handled by for that bundle, if that makes sense. So like the naive answer to this is there's a one-to-one mapping. Everything that says API version bundles.ruckpack.io/v0 kind of plain, those will have provisioner class name core.ruckpack.io/plain. And that's how everything works today, right? In the future, you could see a case where like, well, you know, the provisioner that comes with Ruckpack doesn't do what I want it to do. So I'm going to write another provisioner that also operates against plain bundles and it does the extra logic that I want it to do. So then I'll update my mapping to say anything that matches that API version kind for that manifest format, bundle format, like I'm going to send it over to my provisioner instead. And the cluster admin would do that by updating this lookup mapping thing that we're talking about.
Gotcha. And you were suggesting, so were you suggesting a first class API for this, or is there some sort of defaulting we can do at the provisioner class level? Kind of analogous to a storage class or ingress class. With the, what is default annotation?
That's a good question. I think the hard part, I think you could probably do it, right? Like you could basically say like for each, let me think about this. Well, I think here's where the hard part comes in, right? If you look at the bundle API that we have now, there's like, you can specify different, like 3 different bundles might have 3 different formats. And so it doesn't really make sense to have a default at the like at the provisioner class. You wouldn't really have a default provisioner class name, because like each of those bundles needs a different provisioner class. So I mean, I guess you could just say like, well, the default is plain manifest provisioner, and if you have anything other than that, you have to specify it. What I think I was thinking more, having read the straw man again, is rather than like having implicit defaults, we would just have kind of this other API that's just that we ship, right? We ship an instance of it that just sets up the defaults based on like what that installation is, right? So you could imagine that like a different distribution of Ruckpack and Depi could ship with a different set of defaults and a different set of provisioners. But it seems like regardless, you have to have this API that does the mapping. So why not just make that the thing that you use to ship your defaults? But I honestly haven't thought about this in a lot of detail. So, you know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I might be able to buy that. I probably need it spelled out to me a bit more concretely.
Yeah, we'll need to like write this down and basically pick up that straw man and make it more concrete based on what we actually have today. The other interesting piece of this, which we haven't really touched on, is that right now, Ruckpack doesn't have a provisioner class API. Like you're basically directly referencing the name of the controller that you want to be reconciling your bundle and bundle instance in those APIs. The strawman calls for an abstraction that basically lets you have multiple instances of the same controller with a different configuration, and that configuration would then live in the provisioner class object. So you can imagine like the plain manifest provisioner that we have today maybe has some knobs that you can, a cluster admin could configure on it, and you want to have different, effectively they become different provisioners, but it's the same underlying code with different configurations. So, you know, that's another kind of layer of this too. I don't think it's that much, it really changes that much of what we were talking about before, right? Like whether it's the same controller or a different controller, at the end of the day, it's a different provisioner. And that's what we need to be able to map from, like from bundles to whatever these provisioners are.
I was also thinking about, there's quite a lot of existing metadata that if you look at the registry view on format that exists today, that I think operator authors are expecting to embed in their bundles. Everything from like the CSV icon and is one to things like the GBKs that are provided and required. So I guess that's all, that's CSV level metadata. Is there a way to incorporate, is there a need, or is there a way to incorporate that type of information into the plain bundle world, or are we keeping it a very slim set of metadata for plain bundles? Because in a way, if we have very bare bones metadata implementation, then we are sort of losing information to some degree when you go between the old registry view one format and a new format, right? So I was just thinking about it in that context.
I don't necessarily, I mean, I guess my thought there is that like right now we're only talking about the Ruckpack layer of things, and we're not really talking about the catalog or, you know, operator hub IO or, you know, anything that would ever care to show you an icon or show you a description of the thing, right? So in my mind, like there's nothing that precludes us from later saying like, okay, well, you know, the plain, I guess in my mind, there are different concerns. So you might have a catalog that you want to do resolution where like some of the bundles are Helm chart bundles and some of them are plain manifest bundles, but you want the higher level DEPI layer to be able to basically treat the bundle content and format opaquely. But at the end of the day, like DEPI has to have some sort of common language that it uses. So I would imagine then that like DEPI is going to define the APIs that it needs the bundles to support. And then if you want to use DEPI with your bundles, then you additionally add some more metadata to the bundles that DEPI defines, which would be the requires and provides and properties and constraints and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. I think I'm following. Tyler, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question, and kind of feeds in a little bit to what you just mentioned there, Joe. Would it make sense? I know that the proposed structure here is to have a separated out file. I think my bias would be to have it as labels and just have like a single place for labels inside of the metadata for a bundle. And the reason I say that is it is easy. And this might be a little bit contentious, but it's less opaque, right? Because you can easily see the metadata. You can see like all of these things. It's extensible, so we don't have to define them up front. And so to that end, if we wanted to add more DEPI labels, we wouldn't need to go making API changes to how a metadata file looks. So I suppose my question is, how opposed and what are the oppositions to using labels for this structure of metadata?
Are you talking Ruckpack metadata or DEPI
Ruckpack metadata, sorry. Yes, just like the idea of like the name, the version.
I think what I'd probably propose there, so Tim kind of put some of this in the chat, but like if you go look at the chart.yaml and then you go look at Helm's code for how it loads a chart, there's just a struct that says like, here's the chart.yaml struct. And it just has the fields in it that define the metadata for it. So it's very structured, I guess. I kind of gravitate towards that because then like it's much easier as a user to like know what you're supposed to do to like create the thing. And CSV is a little bit like that, right? Like you can go look at the CSV struct and know how to fill it out. If it's just like an arbitrary, you know, map string, it's hard, like it's a little bit harder to parse. It's you know, harder to know how to fill it in. There's, you know, the documentation for that is a little bit harder. I guess the benefit of a more generic thing is like it's easier to change and add stuff without having to change your structs around. But I don't know. I feel like we probably just need to try to get this pretty right the first time, and then, you know, any extensions would be separate metadata, or
So
could just be additive.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding on the discoverability of a chart.yaml. So that probably sounds like a knowledge gap there. So I'm going to look into that a little bit, but I think what you're saying sounds right.
Yeah, like I guess it, like if we look at this HackMD that Dan wrote up, I could easily imagine us having, you know, right below, this is kind of like a component config, right? It's like it's not a file you can apply to a cluster, but it uses the same sort of type meta that Kubernetes objects use. So you could imagine like right after API version and kind, you could have, you know, bundle version, software version, package name, just as like more fields. And then we'd have a Go struct that literally just is that thing. Yeah, similar to that basically. I would potentially say like, maybe we don't even need metadata and spec. Like this doesn't have to match, the same sort of structure that Kubernetes objects have. We don't have to have object meta and type meta and spec and status and stuff like that. This is just our own thing. So if you go look at component config, like there's a config file for like kubeadm. So if you run kubeadm, you can feed it a config file that looks kind of like this. Yeah, there you go. KBT, I guess, is another good example. Thanks, Tim. And it looks like they do use metadata, but they have info, which is different, right? So yeah, something like that is what I imagine that we would have for bundle metadata. And personally, I kind of like the idea of saying like every bundle that any RuckPack provisioner is ever going to support is going to have in the root a file called bundle.yaml that at the very least has API version in kind. And that's like the meta spec for all bundles, right? From there, then anything that understands how to find that can then self-define where it finds everything else that it expects.
Yeah, and it's probably worth noting too, that these files don't necessarily have to live on cluster GVKs, right? Because I think that's the way kind clusters typically surface, is they have a configuration file that's just in this popular like type meta format. But I'm not sure if that was called out in the doc anywhere.
Yeah, no, I think these are all good. So I think we're leaning towards having it potentially being mandatory, if I understood it, like just for the purposes of having it be interoperable with like different types of provisioners. I think, or I don't know, I wasn't actually sure because Tim also brought up the point of like if we just want to install some like OPA rules or something like that, then in that case we wouldn't necessarily want there to be any metadata.
The other place that is interesting is like, what about all that existing content out there that basically is Kubernetes manifest, right? Like think about an existing Helm chart. They don't have a bundle.yaml. So, but like that's not necessarily a problem. They've got a different chart.yaml that the provisioner knows about if it's a Helm provisioner and can do the things it needs to do. So I think you can make an argument that a bundle.yaml is not required.
Right, and I almost feel like it degrades the kind of like value prop of just give me a directory of Kubernetes manifests when I require a mandatory metadata file. But maybe the value proposition of that is a bit watered down, depending on your perspective.
Right. So like maybe the plain manifest format. I guess where it gets interesting is like, say you had just a plain manifest that the only thing in it was some config maps. Would you ever like, I assume you would probably, if you've gone to the trouble of putting it in this bundle format, you want to have RuckPack install it. If you're familiar with what we're doing here, like we're going to have a DEPI thing that knows how to do resolution. And at that point, like DEPI definitely needs to know some identity metadata. So are we saying that like even identity metadata isn't required unless you're using, like maybe that's what you're saying, Tim, is like maybe even at the RuckPack level, it's optional and really it'll become required if you want to use this bundle with DEPI.
Yeah, I think if you look at, like if I was a user that was interacting with RuckPack-based tooling, and I know we've briefly talked about this, but if I just wanted to provide a command with create and I supply a directory, and maybe what under the hood is doing is creating a local like config map and linking that to a bundle, assuming local volume support, then I don't really care in my mind about the metadata or whether I'm going to be interacting with higher level components like DEPI. I just want to see some stuff get stamped down in the cluster. But maybe this is moving in the wrong direction anyways. It's difficult, a lot of nuance here.
Yeah, no, I think making it optional in that sense and only having it be in place if you want to opt into the higher level sort of resolution component is actually really interesting, because it sort of avoids some of that upfront complexity that you have now, where you have to sort of provide this CSV file, which has a lot of metadata in it upfront potentially, and only provide it if required. So I think that's kind of like a more reasonable direction for now.
The only kind of hesitancy I have about that is that, like, if you just want to apply some config maps, then why did you wrap it in a bundle? Like, I guess I'm trying to figure out like where the bundle comes into the motivation for just deploying a couple of config maps. And then, maybe there's a good reason, but then like, does that reason then imply that you might need some identity metadata?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, maybe GitOps use cases.
But okay, so GitOps use case, you just check the config maps into your GitOps and just kubectl apply the config map. Like,
right. Well, what if I want that like declarative reconciliation of my config maps? I don't know. It seems like a watered down.
that's true. I mean, yeah.
So maybe that is, maybe I can buy that, right? Like, who's going to really package this? Go through the steps just to get a config map on cluster.
And I could see like, okay, you've got a Git repo, you've got a bundle image. Those we expect a bundle.yaml in the right spot or whatever. If we're sourcing it some other way, like maybe that other sourcing layer has a way to let you define at runtime what the identity metadata is, right? Like if it's a config map, maybe you can put that identity metadata in the metadata.labels or annotations or something like that.
How much of, so this is probably so let's say I have a bundle that's, let's say the bundle API supports sourcing and aggregating multiple different source types. Actually, this is going the wrong direction. I'll stop myself ahead of time.
Tyler?
Yeah, I think, Joe, you mentioned this a little bit earlier. So I'm wondering if it makes sense to, I guess I'm questioning the idea that we have some file that is in existence for all bundles, and those bundles all conform to one format. So like, say that we have the API version kind metadata spec structure that we have here. I guess where I'm starting to question that is, you mentioned a little bit, Joe, the idea of having, say, a Helm provisioner. And the Helm provisioner takes the specific config that's related to Helm, that chart.yaml that you were mentioning. If we create this bundle struct and the Helm provisioner has that and it's required, it's just not going to use it. So it's kind of like vestigial information. So I'm wondering if we could have an implementation where we infer some of the information. So like we can infer, I'm just assuming this might not be the cleanest solution, but we can infer the API version and the kind based off of the provisioner, unless I'm misunderstanding that concept, and then have a separate file on a per provisioner basis for the metadata. And so like the plain provisioner might have this format, but the Helm provisioner, this theoretical Helm provisioner, has a different format, and those are separate from each other. And documentation on each side would convey that. Is that something that how do we feel about that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, right? Like it's hard to justify asking Helm chart maintainers to add a new bundle.yaml file to their Helm chart when what we'd ask them for is already in their chart.yaml. So I think the place that it gets more interesting is when you go to build the catalog, the thing that inspects all of your bundles of all the disparate types has to know about how to look up the metadata for each of those types. So like going back to the RPM example again, RPM is one format. So when you run the create repo command that creates all the metadata about a repo that you can use to like create a Yum repository, it knows exactly where to look in all of those RPM files because they're all the same. Or like it knows about the various RPM versions, and it can, you know, look things up based on the schema of each of those RPM files. So I think the corollary here is like, if you have a pile of bundles and you don't know what they are, and you say the equivalent of create repo on them, how do you extract all of that metadata if everything can put, you know, the package name or the version in a completely different place? So, I mean, it seems like the only way to do that is to just build in knowledge of like, here's the set of bundle types that I'm going to support, and I'll just, you know, warn or error out or something on things that I don't recognize. But that doesn't, I mean, maybe we're trying to over optimize. That doesn't seem like all that scalable if we're like thinking about what Ruckpack's goals are. Maybe there's like some sort of plugin architecture where, you know, you just have like, well, I don't know. The hard part is like, if you just have an unknown collection of bundles, you don't even know what plugins you need to have on your system. So it's kind of, and then not only that, but then when you run the equivalent of the create repo command, that thing can't even, all that thing can tell you is like, I don't recognize this bundle. It can't even tell you like, oh, I don't recognize this format, because it doesn't even know how to look up the format. So I guess that's the one rough edge of not having a unified place to look up the schema.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid point that you're making. I'm wondering if because one thing that you have with RPM that you don't have with Ruckpack conceptually is a packager, like something that builds the package. Right now, we kind of put that onus on bundle authors to create it. If we had some structured way for provisioner to say, run this on your manifests and we'll package it how you want, then that problem gets solved, right? Because you can generate this metadata file, and the authors also don't have to recreate it each time. Because we can have our cake and eat it too. You can have the chart.yaml, it does its own thing, but then you have like the required metadata of like the package and all that information you just mentioned, and that gets created at build time. So instead of having to manually create that per bundle, it gets auto-generated based off of the format that you provide it.
Yeah, that would work, but that's then kind of opt-in for Helm chart owners, right? Like you could also imagine a world where, you know, if you look at artifacthub.io, there's, I don't know, hundreds or maybe thousands of Helm charts out there. There's no reason why we couldn't have a provisioner that literally just knows how to consume those Helm charts, or like a create repo equivalent that knows like, okay, well, you know, I'll check to see if this is a Helm chart. Is there a chart.yaml in the root? Okay, like this is a chart. Like I know how to extract the metadata about it. So like, yeah, you could have a tool that knows how to extract the metadata and then create the Ruckpack metadata, but then you basically are forcing Helm chart owners to, you know, opt into that, such that anybody that wants to consume those Helm charts with Ruckpack they're basically limited to the set of Helm charts that the authors have decided to go and do that little bit of work. Am I understanding what you're suggesting correctly, Tyler?
Yeah, I think you definitely are understanding that correctly. I don't really know what you mean by non-starter, Tim, but I think that kind of shuts down the idea. Just the concept that we would have to run like some idea of a packager on every single thing in Artifact Hub. So I'm just kind of thinking through that, but yeah, I don't want to hold up the meeting anymore.
Well, so I mean, we do have, like, if you look at operator SDK, there's operator SDK generate bundle, right? And that thing is specific to registry v1 bundles, but it's basically doing what you're talking about, Tyler, where it says like, okay, well, the input that I expect is X, and in its case, like the input is basically like a whole bunch of YAML, and then the output is a registry v1 bundle. So you could imagine like the same sort of thing existing for like, okay, I'll consume Helm charts and I'll output a bundle that contains the Helm chart. But again, like there's basically this trade-off between like do you want your DEPI UX, like your catalog building UX, to be really smooth? In which case, like now you're kind of putting the onus on bundle authors to do stuff to support the DEPI use case? Or do you want your kind of RuckPack UX to be really smooth, but then the downside is that like building a catalog with disparate formatted bundles becomes more difficult because you have to somehow figure out what all your bundles are.
Yeah, 100%. I'm on the same page with you. I think what I'm thinking through now that I don't have an answer for is say that we do just read Artifact Hub format, the Artifact Hub format, right? And we're like, oh, okay, cool. I have a chart.yaml. I can read this. I can unpack this. How do we provide that information back to a DEPI-like component, right? Like, how do I get identity out of that bundle? In the same way that I would get it for a plain bundle, in the same way I would get it for a registry v1 bundle. I don't have an answer for that, but that's kind of what I'm thinking through after after that conversation.
Yeah, certainly really interesting conversation, really good stuff. There's a whole host of trade-offs, as Joe, as you brought up, and I think as we have more of the DEPI layer sort of fleshed out, it could potentially inform our metadata strategy, at least as it relates to the current plain bundle format that we have proposed.
I suppose like the thing that comes to mind for me is you can make this metadata optional. Anybody that adds it to their bundle, now like you have this discovery kind of thing where the thing that builds the catalog can say like, oh, okay, I see that you're a bundle of this format. Let me go look up the plugin that knows how to read those bundles and return the metadata that I expect to build the catalog. And if I can't like if you don't have that metadata, I've got a few built-in parsers that I'll try, and I'll do best effort effectively. So you could kind of hit two birds with one stone. You could say like, well, okay, we recognize that there's a ton of Helm charts out there that aren't going to have it. Let's go ahead and build in a Helm chart parser that tries to basically detect whether the thing we're looking at is a Helm chart. If it turns out that it is, then great, like they don't have to add that bundle metadata. If there's something that we haven't built a parser for, then the only way that we'll be able to build the catalog metadata is by looking up what you are and then delegating to some tool that can tell us what information we need.
Would the parser be like, would it be like a tool, like we see it as like an OPM like tool, essentially, that is in the sort of hybrid catalog world?
Yeah, like so OPM render is actually a kind of a decent example of this, right? Like OPM render supports SQLite images, it supports FBC images, it supports bundle images, it supports SQLite database files. So like it kind of goes through this detection mechanism to figure out what it's rendering, and then it renders it for you in a consistent way. So same sort of thing, right? You could basically make render understand Helm charts. You could then make render understand how to look in a generic, well, in a specific place to discover the schema of something. And then maybe you'd have some sort of external plugin mechanism that OPM render knows how to call out to that says like, okay, you said you're a Joe's foobar format. Let me go look up and see if I have something in my path called Joe's foobar format parser. And then I'll just call that and pass the bundle reference that I have. And then that'll just return on standard out something that's like a JSON thing that says like, okay, here's all the catalog metadata that like the DEPI API requires.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess we'll know more about the requirements of the DEPI layer, but you would imagine the metadata that it would expect from different like heterogeneous formats would be the same, would reduce to the same thing. So I guess that's why we would want to have a tool like this. No, I'm really excited for that additional layer to sort of play. I think it'll be very helpful to see it and to inform this discussion. No, that's great. Okay. Does anyone else have any more comments about metadata? I know we've been talking about it for quite some time. Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. I just have another topic on the agenda, which was basically any ways to improve our OLM issue triage meeting. I've noticed that meeting lately has not been as productive as it was in the past, really for a variety of reasons, but the main one being that folks on the team are just really focused on newer APIs, things like file-based catalogs, RockPack, DEPI, etc. And there's not much day-to-day work on OLM really being done anymore. And so there's just a big context switch now to go back to do the issue triage, and there's not that much interest in it. So I wrote a quick doc describing the situation, and I had some proposed solutions. I wanted, definitely want Alex to be here, but we have Joe, so we definitely have a representative from the sort of the steering committee. And so I don't know, we only have a few minutes, but I just wanted to highlight this, that this is a potentially issue, and we should think about maybe different ways of having that issue triage meeting be maybe a little bit more effective. So yeah, I think I could go over the doc, but there's not really too much with it.
So one thing that,
yep.
if you don't mind if I interject, so there's some other examples of meetings that do a similar thing that we do in the issue triage, but are a little bit more, I guess, like agenda focused rather than, oh, we're just going to go through all the issues here. So what we could do, and maybe you've kind of presented these as options, is basically say like, okay, we're going to start focusing more on the RuckPack and DEPI and the issues of the, the flavor of the day APIs. But, we're not trying to alienate any OLM users. If you've got a particular issue you want to talk about, then, by all means, put it on the agenda, and we'll talk about the agenda items first. And then with that, whatever remaining time, and obviously we'd want to keep it scoped to like specific issues, right? Like we probably don't want to have this sort of conversation that we had today in that meeting. But like if you've got an issue that's in the repo, or maybe it's not yet in the repo, but it's a bug or a feature request or something that specific you want to talk about, then put it on the agenda and we'll talk about it, rather than us just doing the search and going down the line.
Yeah.
But maybe we do that for OLM issues, and then maybe like for RuckPack and DEPI issues, we do the search, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that's sort of what I was proposing in the first solution. I think that would sort of free up some of the meeting to maybe have more people from the team involved in it. And I would also like to get things like I don't know, file-based catalogs issues and things along those lines to get into that meeting potentially as well. But I think yes, it basically, if there's someone who comes comes along and says, I have the issue 2375 with OLM, then definitely we can try to triage that issue. But most of the context, most of the effort is being spent in newer APIs, and we should be able to focus there. Okay, so I like that. Joe, you like the repurpose the meeting proposed solution. So maybe we could socialize it a little bit more, and go from there. But we could potentially, if we have some agreement, tentatively, we could start that next week, next issue Shiraz, just to ensure that the meeting is still productive, and it serves the need of the community, but also of the developers or maintainers of the projects. Great. Any other thoughts on this topic?
I'll just echo that I like that idea.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I like it too, definitely. Great. So I think with that, we can go ahead and call it for today. I think it was really a productive meeting, really interesting. Thank you all for attending, and see everyone at the Issue Cherish next meeting next week. I think we can try out the new format. So thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, Dan.